So I really appreciate everybody for taking the time to be involved with the community. It's pretty awesome to get a chance to talk to everybody again and get a chance to interact with you virtually at least. I'm looking forward to maybe one of our next in-person events at some point this year. And so I'm excited about that as well. So my name's Dustin Domerese. For those of you who haven't had a chance to meet in person, good to meet you. I have about 18 years experience, technology, consulting industries, specifically around ERP, Salesforce, SAP Business One, Dynamics CRM. So a lot of CRM, a lot of ERP type solutions. And then most recently, a lot of the Dynamics platform with finance and operations, as well as Business Central. And I'm also just a fun fact about me, I suppose. I'm also a certified marriage and family counselor. It helps me whenever I am interacting with some of our clients as well. I'm sure some of you know how that works, to be able to get the departments talking and help them to solve problems. Certainly a part of my job that I enjoy doing. So I'm currently working for a company called Dynamic Consultants Group. And just a little bit about us real quick. We are a global partner-to-partner consulting firm. We're focused on mainly growing other partners' brands. So we really want to see other partners grow and thrive, selling CRM, ERP implementations, helping them to sell solutions, also to do things that maybe they have never done before. So if they don't have an Azure practice, we can step in and really be that practice to help them grow their businesses. We have resources all over the globe, partners all over the globe, as well as full stack development, implementation support, sales, marketing, and offices located all around the world as well. So we're excited about a lot of the opportunity coming in Dubai as well. That's something that we wanted to announce, that we actually have an office coming this year or the first part of next year in Dubai. So we're excited about being able to open up an international office there. We're also excited about a new program that we've launched called Power Learn Academy. And Power Learn Academy, if you know any friends or family that are looking to really do a complete career change, we're offering a Power Learn Academy program, which is a 16-week boot camp style program that gets team members involved and immersed in the Microsoft technology stack. So it's 100% Microsoft, 16-week boot camp. It walks them through everything from CRM to field service and project service, as well as Business Central and some F&O, as well as things like Power BI and Canvas apps. And it just really starts to immerse them in the technology. So it's really great to be able to see someone who has no experience or maybe even no degree to be able to change their career and change their life by starting to get involved in the world of Microsoft development, Microsoft consulting. We also have a specific part of our program that's focused on minorities in technology, veterans in technology, and women in technology programs. So we really want to try to give those who may not have a degree in the industry, may not have any relevant job experience, a chance to break into the wonderful world of Microsoft. So with that, let's talk a little bit about deleting our integrations. That's the topic of today's session. And you're going to find that a lot of what we talk about in this session is not really revolutionary things. I mean, we're not looking at completely changing everything about the way that you do. But what I do want to do is I want to challenge you a little bit to think differently about your data integrations. And I know every project, every client that we work with is going to have some kind of integrations involved in their projects. Almost all projects that I've worked on in the past have had at least some kind of integration. So what I really want to do is I just want to challenge you to think about data integrations bigger than just simply moving data from one system to another. And think about the patterns for the way that you do that, maybe in a more creative way that you've never had a chance to think of before. So before you click the delete key, even though the session is called delete your integrations, don't delete your integrations just yet. You really need to take a step back and start to plan and think about the ways that you're currently doing integrations before you can really decide what the best process is. So sometimes you can't delete your integrations, right? Sometimes you just need to be able to move data, but from one system to another. But the main part of this is you really want to ensure that the business process that you're trying to solve drives the need for that requirement. So you don't just want to build an integration because the client or your end user or your IT director has said we need an integration. You really need to think through what is the problem you're trying to solve and what's the best solution in order to be able to actually solve that business requirement or fix that business problem. And so I want to challenge you to think differently and really make sure that the requirement drives what it is that you're doing from an integration standpoint. So how do our customers think about integrations? How do our end users, how do they think that integrations work? Well, I know all of you have probably heard the phrase, well, we just want the out of the box integration. We just want the integration the way that Microsoft gives it. Well, that's a really utility mindset. There's really kind of this, we should be able to flip the switch and the software fixes our business problems. It makes us more efficient. We no longer have to enter data in two different systems. It eliminates all the mistakes that our people would make. And then our clients kind of get upset whenever the integration that we built doesn't really work that way. But the reality is that it's not a utility mindset. We can't just flip a switch and build integrations. We have to think differently about data integrations between systems. So think about like a very common quote to order integration. I'm sure everyone's kind of heard that requirement. We want sales to be able to enter a quote. We want that to go to an order. Well, you've got to have customers. You've got to have products. You've got to have kits if there are any, bill of materials if there's any. You have to have price levels, price lists, units of measure, unit groups, shipping methods, discount groups, all of those sorts of things just to transfer a quote over to an order. So it gets complicated. This is really more like what an integration looks like. It's not a light switch, it's process flow. It's decisions that you have to make. What we do is complicated with integrations. And not only are the systems complicated, but sometimes you're working with customers and departments that have years of processes that have to be unraveled and decisions that have to be made about the direction that data needs to go. So we really need to stop oversimplifying data integration, and we need to start thinking about it in a way that is very process driven. You can have different data models between two different systems or three different systems. You can have decisions that need to be made on which direction data is going to flow. You have to map the fields to make sure that data conversions happen between field types. If you have pick lists or option sets in systems, you've got to make sure those are mapped correctly. You may have data in one environment that does not exist at all in the other, and you have to match it up and really do translations of data between systems. As an example, if you've got a price list in one system and that price list doesn't exist in the other, then that order to quote to order integration isn't going to work. So you've got to make sure you're thinking about all of those little things and making sure that you're using the right pattern. And all of that happens even before you really talk about like the technology of how you're actually going to move the data or do the integration. They're complicated, and that's why they always go over budget. I'm sure no one has ever experienced a delay or an over budget data integration, right? Because they're complicated. It's not easy, and there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. So it's important that when we make the decision to go into an integration, that we do it intentionally, that we make sure that we really need a data integration before we decide to do it. There's nothing worse than a data integration that starts out as a great idea and ends up as a nightmare of a decision that we should have never done before. So that is something that we really need to think about. Be intentional about making the decision that you do need a data integration. So how do we simplify that? How do we take the complicated and break it down and make it simple? Well, I'm going to give you a few tips here, 6 tips on how to make that more simple. The first thing is be honest about the complexity. Like, let's not estimate, but let's also not underestimate the complexity of what it is that we're trying to do. We have to be honest about it. We have to make sure that we have the budget for things. We have to make sure that we are setting expectations internally about the complexity of it. We have to make sure that we're communicating properly about the complexity and the decisions that are going to have to be made. We can never say that it's easy. And if you're working with a sales team that's out selling products, or if you're working with internal users that are constantly talking about how easy data integrations are, you got to change the language and change the mentality internally to make sure that you're being honest about them being hard, because that's first step to making sure that you can simplify it. Number two is there is no such thing as out of the box. Stop saying out of the box. Customers always want it. I want the out of the box integration. I want the integration that just works the way that the utility, the light switch should have worked. That never works. Even if that is the out of the box integration, even if you can do that, it isn't going to fit, and it isn't going to solve the correct business problems. You can't get away from having to take the time to actually design a good system. You really need to take the time and make sure you're designing first and then building second. Third thing, start simple. So as an example, let's say you're doing a customer integration. You want customers from one system to another. That's a really common example of a data integration. Customers, start simple, just integrate the customer name, just the name and the number, something like that. And then as you grow, start doing things like adding in the address, adding in the contact information, adding in all the shipping addresses, adding in the payment terms, all of those sorts of things that that you'll eventually need. But don't do it that way to begin with. Start simple. Make sure it works. Make sure you can test it. Make sure that the processes work the way you expect them to before you start adding in all the complexity of every field and every table. So it's important that you don't over-architect at the beginning. Over-architect at the end, not the beginning. The other part of this is, you need to really start thinking about data integrations as a parallel project to an implementation or a new development effort. Don't oversimplify the fact that it's just going to be some tasks that are in the overall project. It really is its own project. Data projects are their own animal. They are complicated. You've got data cleanup processes that need to happen, all the decisions that need to be made. There's just a lot of stuff that goes into those. So make sure that you're really kind of thinking about running it as a parallel project, but in a separate work stream altogether. You can also do things like running it in parallel with work streams that are involved with other parts of the business. As an example, let's say that you're rolling out, a project accounting solution. You want to be able to take that and run a data migration or integration project in parallel with that, so that way you have the data that you need. Think about those as two separate projects, not just one project that has different tasks, because the data project is complicated, and making sure that you have the right people, a separate project manager sometimes, as well as dedicated resources that can focus on it, not just resources that you're taking from another work stream, is going to be extremely important. So the people part of it is extremely important as well. So the other part of starting simple is just, it helps user adoption. It helps build confidence that the integration that you're building is actually working. And so that's really important as well. I've been a part of project teams before where it just felt like they never had confidence that the integration would ever work correctly, because there were always challenges with it. But when you start simple and just integrate a few fields, they start to build up some sophistication around their confidence on the data integration that they're trying to do. Number 4, design strategically, implement tactically, and then test it thoroughly. Number 1, you've got to design it. You got to know your source. You got to know your destination. Take the time to learn the source and destination. Don't just say, oh, well, here's what my JSON object looks like, or here's what my XML object, or here's what the data model behind the scenes look like. I'm good. I can just create it the same way and it'll work the same way. No, take the time to really understand the source and destination systems, so that way you can design correctly. Understand how it works. Don't just move the data. The other part of it is really designing and architecting with the customer. So whoever your end customer is, whoever's the consumer or the user of this integration, design with them. Take them down into the details of the fields. Actually let them make the decisions on which fields we're going to transfer. How are we going to translate the data between the systems? Because that will then help them understand the complexity as well as being able to get the correct answers based on the team members that are actually using the system on a day-to-day basis. The other part of this is defining who the data owner is for every table or every entity or every work stream that you're working in. So if you're moving customers, who's the data owner for customers within the business? Who's the data owner for orders or quotes within the business? That's going to be a really important thing to define up front. So that way there's one person who's responsible for making the decisions regarding integration and that they are really, really invested in making sure that it works correctly. Number 5, decide on a system of record for each record type. Well, we all know sometimes this is not possible to have only a single system of record, but it should really, really be the rare exception that you try to have more than one system of record for each type of data. Try your best. Try to outline processes that make it work where you can have a single system of record for each type of data. What's the system of record for customers? What's the system of record for pricing? What's the system of record for inventory items? Making sure that you have as much as you can get away with having a single system of record for that data is just extremely important. Number 6, implement the correct integration pattern. So once you have really made the decision, you've gotten through all the design, you've made sure you've got the right people involved, you've then decided on which system of record that you're going to implement. Now you've got to actually pick the correct integration pattern. Like, how are we actually going to do the integration? The other part of this is don't just read, but don't just take whatever the customer says and take that as the truth. Make sure you're asking good questions to make sure that you're picking the right integration pattern. So many times we've heard customers just say, well, I just want it to flow both directions for every record type, for every type of data that we're working with. But you need to really be asking the questions. Why do you need that? What's the reason why you want that data to flow between those systems in multi directions? So making sure you know what the long-term strategy is for the company or for the business users that you're working with, whatever department you're working with, before you just build integrations, make sure you take the time to really know what that long-term strategy is. And Raz, my screen blipped there for just a second. Could somebody confirm for me that you can still see? Maybe just give me a thumbs up that you can still see here. Looks like my monitor lost connectivity for a second. I'm going to try the sharing one more time. All right, I reshared, so hopefully that worked out for everybody. So once you've kind of picked a specific pattern, we'll talk more about that in a minute about which pattern you should select. But make sure that the very end result that you're picking with the end user is that you actually have something that's measurable and attainable, what the goal is for the integration. A simple example of this is I want to eliminate entry in 2 systems. What I used to have 2 different systems for this data. I want to make sure that I only have one system, and that way I can actually have a single place to enter data. Well, that's a great goal. Now we can actually measure that. We can know at the end of this project, do we have one place to enter the data or 2? And you can design the integration appropriately based on that requirement. Or maybe I want to reduce the number of clicks it takes to enter a PO by 10. I want to be able to create a PO within 10 clicks. Well, that's a really, really good requirement because now we can measure it. We can count the number of clicks and we can know whether we were successful with that integration for purchase orders. Or maybe I want to enable all users across the organization to create a quote or create a sales order. Well, that's a really good requirement as well, because maybe not everybody has access to supply chain, or maybe not everybody has access to the F&O module or the Power App or whatever it is that you're using for quotes and orders. So now we have to think about it differently. We have to actually create our integration in a place where all users would have access to it. So when you start with the end goal in mind, it becomes a little bit easier to focus on the right thing. There's also the measurable goal that I'm sure everybody has heard. I want one place to view everything about a customer, right? The mythical 360-degree view of a customer. Well, that is a good requirement, because now whenever we get to the end of the project and the customer says, why are there 500 fields on this one form? We can say, well, the requirement was that we had one place to view everything about a customer. So do you want a single screen with everything on it, or do you want multiple screens that you have to click through? But that's not what the requirement was. So making sure you have it defined up front helps you to plan with the end goal in mind, which is extremely, extremely important. Well, sometimes when you're getting into integrations and you're starting to build data integrations, the constant sprints and releases and design meetings can really all cause a lot of stress to start happening within the project team. But most of the time, you can start to see some of the red flags ahead of time. Anytime you start seeing your customer or your department start to blame who the previous partner or consultant was, well, that integration doesn't work because our last partner really just messed it up. Or the last person that designed it just didn't do a good job of designing it. Or maybe the vendor that was selected, the Microsoft system that we picked, it just doesn't work. We should have went with Sage, or we should have went with a different ERP system. Blame the software. Make sure that the software, we get a different software next time. All of those things are just excuses, when the problem actually is probably the people. It's normal for us to not have defined the requirements correctly, or not to have built it appropriately. Or maybe we tried to do too much. We tried to make the project bigger than it actually was. It's important that you admit that you don't know how to build an integration, or that you don't know how to fix a problem or how to solve a requirement before you can actually pick the right solution to do it. So question everything. I'm sure everyone's kind of heard the saying before, when all you have is a hammer, every single requirement that you see, it looks like a nail, right? So sometimes we get in old habits. We start to say, well, this is the way I did the integration before. This is the way I'm comfortable with it. I'm really good at SSIS, so that's what I'm going to use. Or I'm really good with Azure Logic Apps, so I'm going to use those. Or I'm really good with Power Automate flows, so I'm going to use that, when that may not be the right solution for the specific requirement. Every problem is not a nail. We had a customer one time that we worked with that actually built a Windows application, a UI that they built on top of a CRM system in Dynamics, because the developer only knew C++. They only had built C++ Windows development in the past, so that's how they did it. They just basically built a brand new user interface on top of a Microsoft CRM system. How silly is that? Because they only knew how to do C++ Windows development, that's the solution they picked. As a consultant and as a developer, as a user of these systems, don't be afraid to admit that you might not have the right tool for the job. You may need to go out and buy an integration tool. You may need to go out and buy some sort of a tool that will allow you to clean up data, or bring in a consultant to help you to manage your data, or implement a master data management system. You may not have the right tools for the job, but it is your responsibility to make sure you're selecting the right integration pattern for whatever the business requirement is, and that you let the business requirement dictate the tool that you use, and not just using the same tool because it's what you've always done in the past. So let's think about what some of the common integration requirements are. We talked a little bit about these before, but as an example, single point of data entry. Let's say you've got, accounts in CRM, and you want to integrate that with your finance and operations customers, or maybe vendors. Well, that requires a data integration, because you have to move data between two systems. We know we need to enter it in one spot, but the end result is it needs to be in two different systems. That requires data movement. You've got to build an integration to do that. Or maybe like the example we gave before, a quote to order. or maybe a sales opportunity into an ERP quote, something like that. That requires data to be moved. There's also another type of integration that I like to call process integrations. As an example, a trigger happens in one system and something different needs to happen in another system. You're not necessarily just moving customers, you're not necessarily just moving quotes and orders, but what happens is something different needs to happen. As an example, a new website lead comes into your website, that needs to then go into a CRM system as a lead and trigger a marketing automation process. Or maybe a case comes in from a customer service portal that needs to be logged inside of a CRM system as a case, and then notifications sent out to the appropriate individuals that there's a new case or a new ticket that they need to work on. Or maybe you've built like a website landing page that can trigger a request for service in field service, which then also needs to potentially create work orders or tie to inventory. Those sorts of things tie more than just data, they're processes. People need to be notified, or customers need to be notified. We need to send emails, or whatever the case is. Those types of things are process integrations, but they still require us to move data. We're going to have a data integration of some kind in order to do that. Also, data synchronization. We have two different systems and we want it to always be in sync. Customers in our CRM system should always exist in our ERP. Well, first thing I want you to do is I want you to challenge that requirement, because many times, even though you have two systems, we should really be challenging the requirement. Do they need to be in sync all the time? Maybe it's okay that the data isn't totally in sync. Challenge that requirement. Make sure that you are asking the right questions to be able to see if that truly is a requirement for data to be in sync, or if it just makes everybody feel better because the data is in sync. Whatever it is, if that is a requirement, you have to move data. You got to move data between one system or another to make that happen. So it would require a data integration in order for you to make that happen. And then the one we talked about earlier, I want a single view of data across systems. So maybe I have an ERP system, I have a CRM system, I have a web portal, and maybe I have a ticketing system that I'm using behind the scenes as well for customer service. I want one place to see the data for all of my customers. That doesn't necessarily need a data integration. There could be other solutions for that. And we're going to talk about more of those in just a minute, what some of the possible solutions are. But you don't necessarily need to build a data integration when the requirement is to view the data across multiple systems. The key word there is view or read the data. That's the important thing to keep in mind, is any time that the requirement says I want to look at the data or I want to view it, you might not need an integration for that. So don't just build one because you think that you need it. Really start to analyze the requirement and see if it's required. Also, legacy system access. I know we've been guilty of this a lot, where we move data from a legacy system into their finance and operations or business central or CRM system because we just figure we need to migrate the data. Well, what if you could give someone a view of that data from their old system without actually having to move it and corrupt the new system that they're working in? So instead of moving all that data and doing a data migration, maybe we could just provide them read-only access to information from another system by an Excel export, by putting it in SharePoint, by putting it in an Azure SQL database, or maybe even just showing them from web services connected to another system, show them the data from another system without actually having to move it. So whenever you start to think about migrations, think about them in this way too. You don't necessarily need to move the data all the time just to facilitate a data migration. So once you know what the requirement is, only then can you really pick the right pattern for solving the problem. So here are some of the patterns for data integrations that I want you to consider. The first one is called a point-to-point integration. So when something happens in system A, it needs to trigger something to happen in system B. Well, this doesn't necessarily require a third-party integration tool. We could use a tool like Power Automate, or something like a custom Azure webhook, or things like that that would be able to actually move that data from one system to another without having to have a full integration tool to do it. Because you just want, when one thing happens in system A, for something else to happen in system B, a point-to-point integration where you're dealing with one record at a time. Take that also with a service bus integration. This is different. So if the requirement is I want a single spot for all the data to live, and then based on what kind of data it is, it needs to go to a CRM or an ERP system, or maybe multiple ERP systems. That is really more of a service bus type integration where you have messages that come into a central repository or a hub that then get decided where they get sent. Think about it as more of a bus that transmits messages between systems. Well, you really need a tool for that. We like to use Azure, either something like an Azure Service Bus or an Azure SQL database that kind of acts as a warehouse or acts as more of a central repository for the data. That's the way we like to do it. There's all kinds of service bus type solutions out there, but really make sure that you think about if you need a service bus solution before you just go out and use one. Because maybe what you need is a point-to-point or another type of integration. Service bus integrations can get complicated very quickly just because of the nature of what it is you're doing. So make sure that you're picking the right pattern. The third type of pattern to consider is what's called a polling integration. So a polling integration is probably the most common that you see across data integrations, especially in the Microsoft Dynamics world. And the concept of that is looking at a system and deciding what has changed and then moving the data that has changed to another system. You're dealing with multiple records, so it's not point to point. You're dealing with a set of data. So you're dealing with multiple sets of data all at once, and you're basically saying, did it change? And if it did, move it. A lot of times those require third-party provider tools. Now you could build something like an Azure Logic app, or you could do this with Power Automate, tools like that, but it just gets really difficult sometimes to know what data has changed, what data has errored, or what issues you're having with the integration, having notifications when the integration doesn't work. There's a lot of complexity to that because you're dealing with data sets moving from one system to another. So you just have to have extra complexity to know what went wrong if something did go wrong. So a lot of times tools like Scribe or Kingsway Soft or Cozy Rock or tools like that that you can actually use for third-party integrations are the better way to do polling type integrations. Now, think about those three are probably the most common: point-to-point, service bus, or polling. You're going to use those more than any of the others, more than likely. Broadcast is a less common, but it kind of is a mix between polling and point-to-point. As an example, you may have one source that has multiple destinations. This is pretty common in a manufacturing organization, whereas a single quote in a CRM system may need to go to multiple ERP systems based on who's manufacturing a specific component. So as an example, if you've got 5 legal entities and you have a single quote in CRM, that may then need to go and hit 4 different ERP systems to be able to submit orders for all the correct components that need to be manufactured by all the legal entities. So that's a pretty common way of thinking about broadcast pattern. A single data record needs to go to multiple pieces of data in multiple systems. That really requires custom development. So you really got to think about custom development. You could probably do it with some third-party tools, but it just gets a little bit complicated. We personally like to use custom development for more broadcast type integration patterns. And then read-only. So we're going to talk about read-only a little bit more in this session because I want you to think about read-only in a different way. All of those could really be their separate sessions. We could have a session on point-to-point and service bus and polling and broadcast. We could have a separate session on each one of those and really get into all of the detail about each one. So there's a lot of complexity that I'm oversimplifying with those for sure. But I want to dig a little bit deeper into read-only because in this session, I want you to walk away feeling challenged on whether or not you actually need a data integration for what it is you're trying to do. So what are some of the ways that you can build read-only data integrations? So let's say you don't necessarily need to move data, you just need to see it. Well, don't move it if you don't have to. Just build a system that you can actually use to see the data. And one way to do that is with reporting tools. So any way that you would build a report normally in any system that you're using, whether it's SSRS or whether it's Power BI reports or whatever they are, reporting is a good solution for showing data across multiple systems. So what's some of the good things about reports? Well, they're familiar development. Most all of your consultants or functional users have built a report sometime in their career. And so you got a lot of team members that could probably help out to build reports. And you can also do a lot of complex queries sometimes with reports that really help. Also, if you're just doing something simple where you want to show a list of orders from one system in another system, a report probably is going to solve the problem. It's a simple way to do it. You can also many times connect to any data source. So you can connect across platform, you could connect to an SAP system, you could connect to an Oracle system, you can connect to a SQL database, you could also connect through web APIs. Like you can do a lot of things with reports to connect a variety of data sources to bring the data in. And many times they can be pretty low maintenance. Once you've got a report built, there's not a lot of things that can go wrong with them, except for maybe that the data source is not available or you have authentication issues, things like that. So you do have some maintenance, but it's pretty low compared to other types of read-only integration solutions. Also, it can be real time or it can be scheduled. Like reports are pretty good about you being able to cache data and be able to show it from one system to another in real time or based on a scheduled refresh. So you've got some flexibility there with reports. So what are the bad things? What are the reasons why you wouldn't pick a reporting tool to do a read-only integration? Well, sometimes you're pretty limited as to what you can query. So there's not always a lot of extremely complex joins and cross joins and multiple data sets and subqueries. You can't get extremely complicated a lot of times with reports without getting coders involved, without getting developers involved. So you have to think about that. Also, context filtering can sometimes be fairly complex depending on what system you're using. As an example, if you're on a customer record in Dynamics and you want to show a list of orders from some other system or show a list of quotes from a CRM system, well, sometimes being able to filter based on the context of the record that you're on can just get a little bit complicated. And you may need to get developers involved in order to do that. Also, sometimes multiple sources are difficult. So if you want to combine 4 different data sources into a single report, sometimes that gets difficult to do as well. You may even need something like a data warehouse to facilitate multiple sources and to be able to flatten the data in a way that you can use it in a report. Whereas if you used a different pattern, maybe you wouldn't necessarily have to have a data warehouse or a central place for that data. Also, just reports are limited in what you can do from a user interface standpoint. Sometimes they're ugly, and sometimes they just don't have a lot of flexibility in what you can make them look like and the user experience and those sorts of things. And I know we talked about read-only integrations, but I'll tell you why this is important here in just a few minutes. But you also can't really do anything more with a report than just show data. So you couldn't allow, other than maybe like a drilling down of more data, there really isn't anything that you can do other than that to create more actionable information within a system. So let's talk about custom development. Like you could build some custom development components that also facilitate read-only integrations. As an example, you can have some web components that are embedded inside of a form that you then show data from some other environment. So what are the good things about building custom read-only solutions? To build a custom UI that would give data from another system and show it in yours? Well, you have flexibility. You can literally build anything with with custom code, right? I mean, you have complete freedom to really do whatever you want to do. So that's a good thing. You can make it look and feel very seamless. So you have a seamless interface between the applications. You can make it, as an example, a CRM system look and feel like the ERP system, or you can make an ERP system look and feel like a CRM tool because you have complete flexibility over the user interface. Also, with custom development, you have the ability to do reading and writing of data. So you could not only show a list of information, but you could give them the option to do something else with it. And you can do a lot of things in real-time processing. So you could in real time go grab data from a web API and show it inside of a custom development component. So what are the bad things about building custom development to facilitate integrations? Well, number one, you got to write code, right? It's custom. So a lot of times you're going to be required to do some custom coding in order to make it work. And so that is one of those things that you just have to make sure that you're set up to do inside of your organization. Are you really ready to have maintenance for all the future updates that need to come into play? Are you really at a place where you can offer check-in and be able to actually manage custom coding the right way and facilitate a lot of ALM processes? So you got to make sure that you're actually a custom development shop to do it right. And that's sometimes a big benefit, and sometimes it's a big negative depending on the company or the organization that you're working with. You also just have to be aware that it's probably going to break in the future and you're going to need to do some things to it to keep it working. You need to constantly be doing maintenance mode and testing and making sure that you're rolling it out to development environments and testing it and really following good practices for doing it. Also, you got to have a web API. You can't really do custom development unless the system you're using is like an on-premise type SQL environment or something like that. You really have to make sure all of your sources and your destinations, all the data that you need, are all web API accessible. And sometimes that can be impossible, or sometimes it can actually be complicated depending on the environment you're working in. Also with custom development, especially if it's, you're building HTML applications or you're doing some things like that, there can be some complexity with large data sets. So when you're dealing with big data from a warehouse or things like that, sometimes custom development can just get slow, and you don't want to slow down your user interface. You don't want to slow down the actual application just to facilitate a data integration. So what are some of the other alternatives to doing this? Well, I'm going to show you two examples right now from a system that we've built. One of them is an example of Power BI and how you can do read-only data integrations using Power BI. And then the other tool I'm going to show you is actually a Canvas app that's embedded inside of an application that would show you how to do a read-only integration using a Canvas app. So I'm going to show you these two examples, and hopefully it will start to unlock some ideas for you on some of the ways that you can think about your integrations in your environments. So two examples here that I'm going to show you just with some of the slides. This is a real world example of what we've built for one of our customers. So this is an example of an integration of products and order quantities coming from a finance and operations system into Dynamics CRM. So we have a Dynamics CRM system, or a Dynamics for sales, and you've got a customer record. And what we did is we just created a little sales trend tab there at the top that actually embeds a Power BI dashboard. And this Power BI dashboard is basically pulling all products and the quantities, both ordered and shipped, from F&O, showing it for that customer. So we didn't move all the products. We didn't have to integrate the price list. We didn't have to integrate all the order history. We didn't have to do all of that because we're not moving the data. We're just simply showing it in a user interface. And so this gives a nice little snapshot of the way that you can do some of this without ever having to move a single piece of data. And the cool thing about this is all clickable as well. So we can click through and we can drill into it and we can see more information. Just really think about kind of embedding Power BI or embedding reports as a way to facilitate some of these integrations instead of actually moving data between the systems. So the next example we're going to look at is a Canvas app. So this is an example of a Canvas app, and this was a pretty complex problem that we were solving for one of our customers. So they actually did invoicing, and they also did their AR out of Business Central, and they also had an SAP system that they're using for manufacturing. So they needed orders to go into there for demand planning and for manufacturing, a breakout of bill of materials, all of those sorts of things. So what we did is we created a single Canvas app that gives the ability to see things from both finance and operations and from from Business Central and from SAP. This could just as easily be any ERP system, but the idea here is that you can take lots of different systems and combine it into a single, nice, easy to read dashboard by using a tool like a Canvas app builder, Power Apps, to be able to embed that inside of another system. So as an example, we've got our lifetime customer orders. We've got our year-to-date customer orders. So we're aggregating data to show it. We're also showing total invoice counts. We can then actually click and it will take us into the sales detail. So if we click into the detail, I've now got all of my invoices that are from Business Central. I've got my sales orders that are coming from SAP, and then I've got a list of returns that are actually coming from Business Central as well. So we've got two different systems that look like a single dashboard, and we didn't ever actually move any of this data to do it. It's just simply looking at the Canvas app and pulling that data into a single spot so that way users can see the information. Now, because this is a Canvas app, the other nice thing is you can then keep drilling, right? You can click on a specific invoice and see the details. So now I can see the products, I can see the prices, I can see the quantities, all of that coming from the invoice that is in Business Central. And based on that, we could then click into a product and we can see the details of the product. What was our price per unit? What was the amount that we sold it for? What's the description of the item? What's the item number, the invoice number? But this is where creating a tool like a Canvas app embedded inside of another system is really cool, because it cannot just be read only. You can then take it to a new level and do things like a return. So we actually, on that right-hand side, we actually have the ability there for us to create a return based on this item. So as an example, a customer service rep who may be on the phone with a customer can look up their invoice, they can look up their products, and then they can choose to issue a return because maybe that customer is actually returning an item or is sending it back, or maybe we received it at the dock and we need to actually issue the return. We have the ability to do that now without ever actually moving data between systems, because all you're doing is looking at it from another system, but from a user standpoint, it all looks like the same spot. So that's one of the big benefits of doing something like a Canvas app, or embedding it, or doing something more of a custom development option rather than just moving data, is you can actually start to do things that are actionable from one system to another without too much additional effort to do it. So I hope this kind of gives you an interesting example, or a good example of how you can start to think about read-only integrations, not necessarily just moving data from one system to another because someone asked for an integration, but instead thinking about the requirement. If the requirement is to see it or to be able to take action on a single record, you don't necessarily need to move all of the data from one system to another to do that. So why is getting the right answer so difficult? Well, that's because there are lots of patterns. There are lots of requirements. There are lots of things to consider when thinking about an integration. And I hope I've challenged you a little bit to look at it from a different perspective in this session, to really think about the way that you're designing, the way that you're building, the way that you're doing a lot of these. But also thinking about it from a standpoint of budgeting your integrations, making sure that you're really considering all the moving parts of an integration and challenging the way that you've always done it before, so that way you can get the right answer and do it differently than you ever have before. So with that, we are going to be giving away a set of Surface earbuds. So what you can do here is you can actually scan this using your phone, and this is going to pop up a link, the QR code. If you scan it using your screen, it's going to open up a link to a form that you can actually submit on that form to be able to be entered to win a set of Surface earbuds. So if you click on that, you can enter your information and be entered to win a set of Surface earbuds. And our team's going to be doing that drawing here at the end of the conference on Saturday, and be able to give you the opportunity to win. So hopefully you win. Really appreciate you joining in on the session today. And Raz, we can leave this up for a few minutes so that everybody can scan and be entered to win that set of Surface earbuds. But I'll turn it back over to you and our next presenter. I know we're getting close to the end of the day, so I certainly want to be sensitive to everyone's availability, and grateful that they would stick around for the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Dustin, for that. Always a great pleasure. Your storytelling sessions really help especially the technical community to really understand a lot of the techniques that provide a lot of value without realizing. I don't think you realize sometimes that the amount of value that some of the tips that you provide actually offer to consultants that may not be too familiar with those strategic approaches. So huge thanks, Dustin. We will keep the chat open for any questions. I don't think there are any questions in the chat. So we will leave the chat open for another 5 minutes before we introduce the next session. Now, can you also share, or can Kira also share the link to the Power Learn Academy as well in the chat?
I sure will.
Fantastic.
I will share that link to the team in the chat here just as soon as I stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Dustin.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Raz.
Thank you, Dustin. Okay, that was Dustin. So it's a great, it's a nice segue, Dustin's session.